the third talk in our virtual Blackheath History Forum series. My name's Richard White and I'm a member of the committee, and I'm here to get things underway today. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gundungurra. I'd like to acknowledge the Gundungurra and Darug people, who are the traditional custodians of the land that the forum normally meets on, and of the land I'm sitting now. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. A little bit of housekeeping. The talk will last 40 to 50 minutes, and then there will be time for questions. To ask a question, you just need to go to your chat section on the right of the screen and type your question there, and then I'll pass it on to our speaker. Being virtual, I'm afraid you have to organise your own afternoon tea, and I can't help you finding your way to the loo or anything like that. But just a reminder, there are advantages of our virtual format, and that is that you can catch up on the previous two talks by Mark Dunn and Gary Worski if you go to our website, and you'll be able to revisit today's talk again in a short while and watch it again and again, and importantly, send the link to friends. And can I remind you, while you're watching it on YouTube, can you subscribe and also like the forum? Every like helps. Now, I'm really chuffed to be able to introduce today's speaker, Associate Professor Alice Gorman from Flinders University, also known as Dr. Space Junk. She's a world leader in what I've sort of only recently discovered is an absolutely fascinating field of space archaeology. And I can really recommend her recent book, Dr. Space Junk versus the Universe. It's won various awards and been shortlisted for others, but it's one of those books which you just go on, you can't resist telling everybody about. And you keep on saying, did you know, for example, did you know that if you're in a shadow on the moon, you're invisible? I mean, it's amazing. And there's so much in it, so much of Alice, but also I learned so much. It's a wonderful book, and it's available in Glebe Books in Blackheath and all good bookshops. So we'll better get started. Alice, over to you.
Well, thank you, Richard, for that lovely introduction. And it's just fantastic to think that my little book resonates so much with people. So I'm just going to get my presentation set up. I'd like to just add as well, I'm particularly pleased to be here with the Blackheath Historical Forum because I'm a descendant of the Finn family from Hartley. So this feels rather like being in my home territory. So today, my theme is From Earth to Eternity, Archaeology in Space. I'll just check everyone can see my slides. Richard? Okay, just assuming all is working well. So what I should probably do is preface this by explaining what space archaeology is. We're used to thinking of archaeology as something that we do to study human societies in the past, but we can pretty much apply it to any space, any place, any time. And what I and some of my colleagues are doing are looking at the material culture and archaeology of things to do with space exploration. So this is both artifacts and places. In chronological period, we could date it from 1936. So that's when the first rocket capable of getting into space was created. This was the V2, which you see on the slide. And there are only 17 of these left in the entire world, 2 of which are here in Australia. So that's our chronological period. In terms of our geographic range, what we're looking at is the surface of the Earth throughout the entire solar system and beyond its borders in interstellar space. People sometimes say to me, well, isn't this just space history? Why does it have to be archaeology? What's the difference? And there's a few reasons why this is archaeology. One is that while we have an incredible documentary and archival record of activities in the space age, it's also incredibly incomplete and full of holes. We don't have a documentary record for every event. We don't have records of what people thought, and we don't have records sometimes of what they actually did. And we have to go back to the place or to the object to find out what was going on. And I believe we can find new things out about how we interact with space in this way. And in the last few years, I'm sure it hasn't escaped anyone's attention that the human movement into space is accelerating at a great speed. The last 5 years, we've seen incredible changes. And now at the moment, everybody wants to go to the moon or Mars. So it's my belief that we need to use every tool in our arsenal to understand what this means so we can make good decisions going into the future. So what I'd love to do today is, from the comfort of your home, I'd like you to imagine that we are going to be space tourists. We're going to enter a rocket and head out into the solar system and visit a few of these places and objects that are part of the archaeology of space. One of my absolute favourite space objects is this rocket that you see here, which is located in Blackheath itself. So this is the famous rocket, the first of its kind in Australia, that was the victim of changes in playground regulations. They became rather too dangerous. And as I don't need to tell Blackheath residents, was recently returned to its original home in last year or the year before. So this is a wonderful space artifact. This is a rocket which little kids climbed up in parks to dream about going to the moon or going into space. But today we will need something a little more serious. Let's pretend that we have boarded this vehicle. This is a picture of the interior of the Virgin Spaceship 2 craft, which is meant to take paying tourists into Earth orbit, or at least on a suborbital flight. This was only unveiled in July this year. So this is the latest in design for regular people like you or I going into space. And you can see that there's a big focus on being able to look out of the windows and look outside. So with our cups of tea in hand, let's pretend we're on this spaceliner. And we might in fact not have a cup of tea. Perhaps we will be sipping a space beer. Because as the space tourism industry grows, there's going to be a need for things that regular astronauts don't get so much of, and that will be a refreshing beverage, for example. And right here in Australia, Dr. Jason Held of Sabre Astronautics has actually developed the world's first space-qualified beer, which is safe to drink in microgravity. He did this in collaboration with the Sydney brewer, and I'm not sure at the moment, but you used to be able to go and get the terrestrial version in good bottle shops round and about the place. That's a little Australian contribution to the growing space tourism industry. So whatever beverage we have, we're on the spaceliner, and I'd like to take us to a few different locations. Our starting point has been Earth. We're going to leap up into low Earth orbit, over to the moon, across to Venus and then Mercury, and curve around. I'm going to miss out Mars, and I will just be honest and say Mars isn't really my favourite planet, and that's not just because of the recent news. There's not a whole lot of human material culture in the gas giants and the middle to outer solar system. So we'll go to the edge of the solar system and beyond before we come back home on our little journey. So up into low Earth orbit on our spaceliner. And as many people will be aware, we currently have a problem with the amount of space junk that is in this region, from 200 kilometres to 30,000 kilometres around the Earth. This is a representation, more or less, of the distribution of this space junk at the moment. So this contains functioning satellites, of course, that we're relying on for our navigation, our telecommunications, weather reports, all this kind of stuff. But a lot of these white dots also represent defunct satellites that create a hazard because they're moving at incredibly high speeds and could collide with functioning satellites and knock them out and create more junk. So we have a big environmental problem. But because I'm an archaeologist and I'm looking at space junk from this perspective, I find things in this morass that are of heritage interest. Among these are Vanguard 1. This was the second US satellite and the third satellite ever to get into orbit in 1958. And it's still up there. It's the oldest piece of human material. In fact, it has a twin. The rocket that launched it left its upper stage there too. So there's two of them, the oldest human objects that are in Earth orbit. And you see what it looks like. It's this gorgeous, polished aluminium sphere with 6 antennas. Something I love about this satellite, and which gives it a high degree of social significance, is that as part of the mission, the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory organized groups of volunteer watchers around the world to look for it in the skies. So they had to find out whether it was actually up there. And there are a number of these groups in Australia, including one in Sydney. And this is what they used to do. They'd go out at night and literally scan the skies to see if they could see Vanguard 1. So this meant it had a citizen or community science aspect. It had a community of just regular people around the world who felt a lot about this little aluminium sphere. So this is more than just scientific or historic significance. This is social significance. And I would hate to see somebody destroy Vanguard 1 because it was junk, when we could have a more considered process about whether it stays or goes. So another wonderful spacecraft that I love is a little bit in this vein. This is Australis Oscar V. It was launched in 1970. It was Australia's second completely homegrown satellite. And it was also a community or citizen science project. So it was made by a group of students and their mates from Melbourne University. And they also recruited volunteers around the world to track the satellite and send data in. And it also is still in orbit. Technically a piece of space junk, but also part of Australia's space heritage. And at present, it doesn't provide any high risk of collision with a functioning satellite. So my argument would be to leave it where it is until such a time, because it is our heritage in space. The third object in Earth orbit I'd like to quickly look at is the subject of my current research project with my colleague Justin Walsh from Chapman University in California. And this is the International Space Station. On November the 2nd, it will have been continuously occupied for 20 years. 20 years of there always being a tiny human population orbiting above our heads in space. So it's still operating, obviously, but that doesn't mean we can't do archaeology on it. And in fact, with Justin Walsh, I'm studying the photographs that NASA has taken over that 20 years of the interior to effectively do an archaeological survey. The International Space Station is currently in a bit of a limbo state. It might be deorbited by 2028, end up at the bottom of the ocean, if there's enough commercial interest in it. And in fact, Estee Lauder has just paid a huge sum of money to NASA to film an advertisement on the International Space Station. So commercial interest might keep it alive and afloat. But we could also argue that this is a piece of global space heritage too. So maybe they need to hire me to give them an assessment of what should be done with it. So many other amazing objects I could talk about in Earth orbit, but hopefully I've made the point that while a lot of this stuff is considered junk, a lot of it also has a special story to tell in terms of human engagement with space. So I think we need to have effectively a cultural heritage management process for Earth orbit. But let's move along. We're going to the moon now. And on the moon, there's currently over 60 locations where humans have crash landed, soft landed, or landed a human crew on the surface of the moon. There's only a few of them shown in this picture. The green writing represents the USSR lunar missions. The blue writing is the US robotics series of spacecraft, the Surveyors. And the yellow writing is the 6 crewed Apollo missions. So you'll see there's 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17, but there's no 13. And sometimes I say to people, why is there no 13? And maybe a younger generation will say, is it because 13 is an unlucky number? But if you've been lucky enough to see the film of Apollo 13, then you'll know it's because there was a terrible accident and they had to turn back before they could land on the moon. So we only have these 6 sites. Last year, of course, was the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing, the first time humans set foot on another world. From an archaeological perspective, this is a fascinating place. So we could look at the famous boot prints on the moon, not just as the marks of humans who have walked in the light and the very minimal atmosphere of a completely non-Earth body, but we could look at them as part of an evolutionary trajectory that starts perhaps 3.7 million years ago at a place called Laetoli in Tanzania. And this is where some human ancestors, probably Australopithecus afarensis, people think, walked across soft volcanic ash and left a trail of grey footprints to be discovered years and years later. So we could look perhaps at the current evolutionary endpoint of this place as the famous boot prints on the surface of the moon that have been photographed and studied so many times. But we could also look at Apollo 11 as a typical archaeological site. So the black and white line drawing you see on the slide is effectively an archaeological plan. This is the same kind of plan I would draw if I was walking onto a historic or indigenous site on the ground here on Earth. You can see in the middle the lunar landing module. You can see also various locations where instrument packages were placed and where samples were taken of lunar soil or rock to send back to Earth. And on the orange picture shows you the places where the astronauts actually walked. So this is quite an extraordinary archaeological site. But interestingly, for a long time, the fact that nobody had gone to the moon meant that these places were safe from disturbance. This is no longer the case. So the US is making a push to the moon and perhaps onto Mars, and so are many other nations. And once they get there, they're going to do 2 things. They will need to use local resources to sustain their industry or their habitat. And they might possibly also be getting resources that might have market value back on Earth. One of the things that many of these proposals has said is that they might return to the Apollo sites to photograph them, to maybe remove some material that they can use to look at the impacts of the lunar environment on human manufactured materials over that period of 50 years and more. The only problem with this is if you drive your rover or land your rocket or walk onto these sites, you are going to destroy those footprints and you will likely stir up dust that will abrade and wear away the delicate surfaces. So we have another heritage management problem here. Fortunately, NASA has put a little bit of thought into this. About 10 years ago, 9 years ago, they put together a set of guidelines to govern surface activities to try and minimize any damage to these sites. And the guidelines are pretty good. A lot of their recommendation is putting a buffer zone around the site, so a perimeter into which you can't go. But it's not legally binding. It's simply recommendations. And we've got a long way to go before we can ensure that these places survive into the future. I could talk about many other wonderful places on the moon, but I think it's time to move on to our next port of call. This is my favorite planet. It is Venus. And while the US was heading to the moon in the 60s and the USSR was sending its lunar rovers, Lunar rovers and its lunar robotic landing craft, the USSR was also sending numerous missions to Venus. In fact, it has the most landing locations on Venus of any nation. There's 1 US mission that has gone to the surface and there's a few orbiting missions. So on the black and white or the grey map, all the little white squares show you places where a spacecraft has made it down to the surface. What they saw on the surface was probably a little bit like the top picture. So what you see there is orangey browny clouds with a little light sulfuric acid rain coming down from the skies. And the spacecraft standing up like a sentinel in the middle is probably a Venera 13 or 14. So there are a lot of these missions all throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I love the Venera 13 and 14 because to me they seem a little bit like Daleks, and I'm absolutely convinced that there was some mutual influence, mutual design influence with the Daleks. The picture you see down the bottom to me is something extraordinary. So this is Venera 14 looking down on its own feet. The curved structure in the bottom of that photograph is the same as the landing ring you see in the top photograph. So this is a selfie in space, looking down on the surface of another world that humans have never been to and possibly may not go to, because hopefully people have heard the news that only broke this week, which was that a certain gas compound, phosphine, has been found in the clouds of Venus. And one way this may be caused is by anaerobic microbes of some kind. So the Committee on Space Research, or COSPAR, is responsible for the planetary protection policy. And both the Moon and Venus used to be considered basically you didn't really have to take any precautions if you sent a mission there. But this policy is going to have to change. So future spacecraft and missions to Venus are going to have to very stringently sterilize themselves to avoid contaminating what might possibly be our only living neighbors in the solar system or even in the universe so far. And of course, these neighbors, new neighbors of ours, are floating in the clouds. And one proposal for returning to Venus and taking humans is not to go to the surface, which is over 450 degrees Celsius, not a very pleasant temperature, but to live in floating cloud cities. And this is precisely the zone where we think this possible life is. So, okay, this isn't quite archaeology, but I felt I couldn't not talk about this because it has been such huge news, and there'll be another little bit more about it to come. So let's leave my favorite planet behind. Now we're going to hop over to Mercury. So far, we have sent only one mission to Mercury. This is the Messenger spacecraft, which was launched in 2004. Took quite a long while. It's not, you don't just fly straight to a planet, unfortunately. It takes a lot of planning. So Messenger took years to get to Mercury, and then it gave us our first full geological or mercurographical map. And you can see a sort of color-corrected version here that shows you different geological features. In 2015, the Messenger spacecraft ran out of fuel, and in its final experiment, it was sent to crash down on the surface at a speed of 8,000 kilometers. So it will have made a little crater. And at the bottom of this crater, we're likely to find molten metal and maybe crushed and splintered solar panels. If a spacecraft were to come and conduct another survey of Mercury, that crater would likely stand out because its edges would be so fresh, and it might also return geophysical signals that are very different to the rest of the planet. But at present, there was no one to photograph this location. There was no one to record Messenger as it plunged to its death. But interestingly, there is currently a spacecraft on its way to Mercury as we speak. This is BepiColombo, which is a joint Japanese Space Agency and European Space Agency project. And by good fortune, BepiColombo is doing a flyby of Venus on around about October 15th. So this will be the first spacecraft that gets close enough to Venus to maybe get a little bit more data that can help us resolve where the phosphine gas comes from. So they're hopeful it may do that. It all depends on how sensitive its instruments turn out to be, because it wasn't designed for Venus, it was designed for Mercury. So fingers crossed we might get some amazing data. But then BepiColombo is going to fly on to Mercury. It has another flyby of Venus as it swings around to get closer to Mercury in another couple of years. It should get there in 2028. And then it too eventually will crash into the surface and create a second crater. So that is the archaeological record that we will have of Mercury, unless we get more recent missions or newer missions that are sent out to map this planet. So We've got pretty close to the sun, but we're going to curve around now before going home. I'm going to take us out to interstellar space. This is where there are currently 2 extraordinary spacecraft amongst my favourite. These are Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, which were launched in 1977. And one of the most famous things about them is that about 9 weeks before their launch date, Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer and science communicator, got together with another astronomer, Frank Drake. They formed a little committee. They got NASA's permission to put some cultural objects onto these 2 spacecraft. And they came up with the golden records. So both Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 have one of these records. On the records are 90 minutes of music, about 160 photographs, greetings spoken in all the languages of Earth. There's actually an Australian voice in these greetings, but the bloke was an Esperanto nut, so he's actually speaking in Esperanto. But what else is on these golden records is 1 minute 29 seconds of music played by 3 musicians from Milingimbi Island, 3 Yolngu men. And these songs are about their clan country in the Northern Territory. So this music has taken Indigenous Australian culture out beyond the stars. Now, if anyone's going to listen to this in years to come, whether it's future humans or, if some alien species is fortunate enough to fall across the spacecraft, they're going to have to interpret how to play the records from the little signs you see etched on one of the sides. Hopefully you can see them in the picture here. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure I couldn't figure out how to play a record from those clues, but fingers crossed they will be much smarter than me. So, having ventured beyond the solar system into interstellar space, we're going to wind our way back now in the spaceliner. And we've got a little last-minute unscheduled stop first, because there's something else pretty strange floating around out beyond Mars. We come across what's left of a red Tesla sports car launched by Elon Musk in 2018. And carrying on board the text of Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, a Don't Panic sign taken from Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and numerous other cultural symbols. It's a very intriguing object, but I find it interesting in a number of different ways. So I'm going to take us back for a minute. Let's go back to the Apollo era. So in 1969, 2 US astronauts went on an orbit of the moon as in part of the lead up to the Apollo landings on the moon. And on Christmas Eve, they took an extraordinary photograph that's come to be known as Earthrise. So this was a view of the Earth rising over the lunar horizon. And this picture became very influential in kickstarting the environmental movement on Earth. This intensified just a few years later when the Apollo 17 mission took one of the best colour pictures of the whole Earth. And this picture that you see on your right has become known as the blue marble. And seeing the Earth from outside very strongly fed into this sensibility that we were all together on this fragile planet and that we needed to take care of it. So it's more complicated than that, obviously. There's a lot of cultural things going on there. But the third image I'd like to draw your attention to right now is taken from inside the International Space Station a couple of years back. This is the view from the cupola, or the cupola, as the Americans call it, looking towards Earth. And if you look for pictures of the International Space Station just by a random Google, it's more than likely you'll come up with one of these. So this is one of the most photographed interior spaces in the entire International Space Station. Again, it's looking back towards Earth. And the crew on the ISS love on their time off to come and just stare, watch the Earth rolling between them, as a sunrise or a sunset coming around every 45 minutes or so. So we're quite used to these images. They've had a huge cultural impact. Let's go back to that red sports car again. These are the images of Earth that we got from the sports car, and these are real. They look like they're made up, but they are actually real images. Something else is going on here. So the Earth isn't in the foreground of the image as this precious object that we're focusing our attention on. The Earth is actually in the background. In the large image, you see the car jetting away from Earth. And in the smaller image, you see a similar thing. It's on its way out. Earth is being left behind. So this is something we could, or I maybe would interpret this as a representation of the new era of commercial space. And I don't think we've seen the end of where these images and these symbols end up, but I just think this is, to me, quite stunning and quite telling. So, having jetted around the solar system and on our way home, I'd like to finish with a few thoughts about what this all means. So the first thing to note, I think, is that if we look at who is where in the solar system, living human bodies are still confined to Earth. And the rest of the solar system belongs to the robots. We've basically left living and dead robots of all kinds scattered throughout the solar system. But they're not all dead yet. We could also look at these space robots as extensions of our senses. So for me particularly, I feel this way about Voyager 1 and 2. Both these spacecraft actually have a Twitter account, would you believe, and you can follow them and get status updates from them. And at one point a couple of years ago, the US government shut down, and they shut down all their official Twitter accounts, and the Voyagers could no longer be heard in social media. And it's not like we didn't know it was just some person in a room tweeting for them. And in fact, I can tell you who Voyager 2 was. It was a wonderful scientist whose name is Paul Filmer. But just that sense of not being able to connect to the spacecraft or know what it was doing, I found I got quite emotional about it. I felt like I'd had a sense cut off. I felt like my whole solar system had contracted into this small ball around the Earth. So that's my kind of emotional response to feeling that these robots are out in space. And we get data, we get images. They're an extension of our senses in some way. So maybe this is something that makes us start to question about what it even means to be human. However, while there's a number of nations on Earth that would say they are spacefaring, and there's this interesting political division of nations into spacefaring and non-spacefaring, and you might well ask what that means and why that is. I think essentially we have to say that humans are not a spacefaring species. We've got off the planet, we've sent robots out there, but none of us are living beyond about 400 kilometres above the surface. We're not truly spacefaring yet. We kind of haven't gone anywhere. Maybe that's going to change into the future. This also makes me think about how we currently have this small human population, 6 people living in microgravity in the International Space Station. We had, I can't remember how many there were, 16 or so crew who went on the Apollo missions to the moon and experienced what it was like to move about in gravity that is 1/6 of Earth's. And in each of these cases, there are tremendous technological adaptations that need to be made for human bodies to survive in places that they didn't evolve in, that they're not adapted to. So only these 2 examples we have at the moment, but many people are saying that humans need to become a multi-planetary species. We'll have to get used to the idea that Earth gravity and all of the technology and architecture and behaviour that it creates is only one kind of gravity, and that human cultures will possibly develop in others. And they might take quite different forms, because you simply can't do the same things in different forms of gravity that you can, that we don't even think about. It's everyday stuff for us. So thinking about space archaeology and thinking about our record in space has been leading me to try and redefine what are some of the fundamental conditions that structure human culture. And I think gravity is a critical one amongst them. People may also have heard this term, the Anthropocene, being tossed about. And this is the idea that we're now living in an era where the geological processes on Earth are being shaped by human behavior and human materials. And some geologist a million years from now will look down a rock profile on Earth and say, right, there it is. There's the nuclear spike from when they developed nuclear weapons. Here's the accumulation of millions of tons of plastic that has formed a compressed layer in the rock that we can say is the Anthropocene, just in the same way we talk about the Pleistocene or the Jurassic or the Cretaceous. So there's been a lot of attention on what this means for Earth. But effectively, we have taken the Anthropocene into space. There are now not just the moon, but other planetary bodies whose geology and whose processes have had a little tiny intervention created by a small period of time where activities were carried out, or by the decay of these human materials, which will leave, at this stage, a minute trace in the planet's lithosphere, if you like. But, you know, if we keep going back and we keep carrying out industrial activities, maybe that's going to become greater, and we'll have to start thinking about what the Anthropocene means for other planets. So perhaps this is where we end up by taking an archaeological perspective. We end up having to think about the broad trajectories of human evolution and human social life, and what it is that we've come from and where it is that we want to end up. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alice. That all you need to do is post your questions, type your questions into the chat box, and I'll be moderating them and passing them on. While we're waiting for questions, though, one of the many fascinating things in the book is your discussion, I think, of the implications of the space junk that surrounds Earth, and the possibility that, you know, ultimately that might actually prevent us from getting out of Earth. Could you say a bit more about that, and what can be done to allow, you know, to regulate, I suppose, the junk that's in space?
Yeah, this is a big question at the moment, Richard, and one that Australia is playing its part in as well. So we've got all this stuff. We've got, as I calculated, well, at the time I wrote the book, I calculated 8.4 million cane toads worth of junk up in Earth orbit. But it has subsequently, I think, become 10 million cane toads worth of junk. So there's a reasonable amount of stuff up there moving at very, very high speeds, and some areas of Earth orbit are very congested, particularly in the lower Earth orbit region, which goes from about 200 kilometers to about 2,000 kilometers, I guess. And it is moving at these incredibly high speeds, so collisions can cause both objects that collide to break up and create more junk that's moving at high speeds. And we also have the upper stages of rockets. After they've delivered their satellite, they often stay in orbit too, and they often have fuel. That fuel becomes unstable and they explode, more junk. And unfortunately, there's been 2 anti-satellite tests where a nation has shot, fortunately, its own satellite from the surface of the Earth, but again, created a huge number, greater number of junk. So what has been hypothesized is that a point in time might come, which is called the Kessler syndrome, where the number of collisions creates a kind of cascading effect. So you will never get fewer collisions. Every collision creates more bits which collide, which create more bits, and it just keeps self-sustaining. And when that point is reached, if you launch anything into that region of orbit, it will immediately be bombarded with bits of stuff and would have to be incredibly robust to survive. So when we get to that point, we've made orbit unusable. And all of those Earth observation satellites and the navigation satellites, which we use every time we pull our smartphone out to do a little bit of navigation around the streets, we're calling on those satellites. So all of that stuff will have to move back to terrestrial infrastructure. So this is the fear. The problem is that even though this has been recognized as a big issue for some time, and there are sets of guidelines to help people design new missions to minimize the amount of junk that they create, a lot of satellite missions don't even follow those guidelines, so that's problematic. And then there's all the old stuff that's up there as well. Oh, and a new problem that Elon Musk is in the process of launching up to 30,000 satellites into low Earth orbit. And some other companies want to do the same. So it's becoming more dense and more congested. So there's a concept called space traffic management, which is about regulating this so that we actually don't get to the point of Kessler syndrome, and we will be able to access Earth orbit in the future. But I think a really important thing here is that, commercial companies tend not to like doing things unless they're related to their profit margin, I guess. So I think public pressure actually has a role to play in making some of these space companies be good citizens in space. So I do think it's important that people know what the dangers are.
Okay, thanks. Now, I'm not getting any questions. Where is everybody? Is my problem, or is no one answering questions? No one asking questions. I do have another one, though. One of the things I loved about the book was your interest in the popular culture of space, and the Blackheath rocket is there alongside Voyagers 1 and 2 and so on. And I was just wondering, what could you talk a bit about your favourite pop culture reference apart from the Blackheath rocket? And maybe, one of my favourites was the misguided missile competition. What were yours?
Well, I think, when we think about space travel, we often think about, the big technological items, the rockets, satellites, lunar landings, all of that stuff. But in fact, space is sort of interleaved into our everyday lives in so many different ways. You can look at satellite dishes on people's houses. They're using satellite signals, and there's an actual change that's been made to the way houses are designed and the way streetscapes look. Oh, someone is saying, we do have
I got that, yes.
In the private chat. That makes sense. I love this. Someone has said the first play rocket of its kind, the Blue Mountains, leads the play space race. I love it. So just thinking about as well as thinking about all that high tech stuff, looking at how space impacts on human lives isn't complete unless we look at all those myriads of ways that we actually engage with it on a day-to-day basis. So for me, that includes little plastic astronauts in cornflakes boxes, all of the different toys and memorabilia and postcards and astronaut costumes and all of that stuff, food even, and cocktails. So there is a cocktail recipe in my book, and I'll just save you a lot of pain right now by telling you not to make the recipe because it's incredibly bitter. I guess you have to have a particular kind of palate to really enjoy it. But there's a whole raft of different space cocktails, some of which are made using Tang, that powdered orange drink that was invented for astronauts to take into space. The rockets are definitely my favourite. I'd wanted to do something about them ever since I discovered, I'd known them, obviously, people across the country. Rocket parks just stick in people's memory so much. And I wanted to find out how they got to Australia, like what were they doing in Australia? And of course, the story does start in Blackheath with the Rotary Club and Dick West. And there's a whole story, and I'm sure all the locals know it far better than I know it. But that, to me, that's space archaeology too, because that's material objects that people interact with and that form part of the way that they conceptualize the world. And I think that's really important. That, to me, is as valid as studying the Apollo 11 sites on the moon.
Okay, thanks. And now, yes, we do have a myriad of questions. Kate O'Neill, tell us about the cockroaches in space.
Oh, well, one of the things about cockroaches is that apparently they can survive a nuclear blast. They're one of the most resilient creatures on Earth. And, if something really bad happens to this planet, cockroaches are supposed to be among the things that are going to be able to survive and carry on into the future. So, but I guess they're also, I can only speak for myself, but they're also a type of insect that often causes a lot of revulsion and negative feelings. So one day I was looking into 2 experimental space stations that had been launched by a private company, Bigelow Aerospace. Their names are Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. So they were never intended for people to live on, but they're still in orbit. They're testing like inflatable technology. And because no one was ever intended to go there, they asked staff, personnel from Bigelow Aerospace to provide some objects to send up. So there's toys and playing cards and all kinds of objects inside. But what they also did was, as an experiment, they sent Mexican jumping beans, which I believe jump because there's a little moth larva inside them. And they sent Madagascar hissing cockroaches. Now, as far as cockroaches go, these are actually quite beautiful ones, and they're quite large. So people have them as pets, and they have sort of a big sort of feathery antenna, a little bit like a moth. When I learned this, I'm sure I would not be the only person who would think like this. I would think, you're going to send one of the most durable, adaptable insects that humans hate the most into space. What is going to happen? We're going to go back up there and find those cockroaches have evolved into some new kind of space cockroach, and we will never sleep easily again. So they're still up there, the Madagascar hissing cockroaches on Genesis 2.
Oh. Still living?
I cannot say. I'm sure it's like Schrodinger's cat.
Yeah. From Helen Hayward Brown, what efforts are being made to clear up the unwanted space junk? I mean, just what can be done?
Well, the good news, I guess, is that there are a lot of efforts being made. So these are about, firstly, designing new missions to minimize the amount of junk. So that involves building in enough fuel to bring something close to the atmosphere and bring it back in, or passivation, getting rid of the fuel so there's nothing to explode, or pushing something up into a graveyard orbit where it's out of the way of functioning satellites. There's a new type of spacecraft being designed by a Swiss space company called Clean Space One. And that's going to be an all-in-one thing where it launches, performs its mission, and then deorbits itself, all sort of rolled into one beautiful process. The problem is the stuff that was launched long before anybody realized this was going to be a problem. Well, having said that, people thought this could be a problem from the 70s. So it's not like there wasn't an awareness of this. So the issue at the moment is to get rid of something that's up there, we need to be able to go and catch it and either, tip it back into the atmosphere to be burnt up or remove it to some other location. This would involve, with our current propulsion methods and spacecraft designs, it would be incredibly expensive. You'd have to take all the fuel you needed up there to remove one little piece, and there's no incentive to do that. So one thing which would help this would be new propulsion systems. Again, lots of people working on this, that would make it much cheaper to zip around and catch things. And there's numerous designs for spacecraft which can catch things. Not an easy thing to do. You want to catch it and not create more junk in the process. Surrey Satellite Systems, a UK-based company, recently successfully tested in space. So this is the other part. Lots of systems being tested on Earth, but you don't know they will work until you test them in space. But they tested a harpoon method of catching a piece of space junk. They successfully launched a little harpoon into a test surface, test object, and the harpoon stuck. So they tested that in space. So that's really good news. The other big factor here, though, is if you can remove a piece of space junk, then you have the capability of removing a functioning satellite. You have designed an anti-satellite weapon. And at the moment, we need a little bit more work on the sort of international relations side to make that work. It might all be fine. It'll be that one little moment where somebody says, oops, that was your spy satellite? So sorry, thought it was junk. And suddenly we have a very bad situation on our hands. So I think there's some good news. People are working on this. It's become a huge, huge issue. There's lots of people researching it in Australia as well. So we're doing our bit to try and make it better, but we're not out of the water yet, I guess.
Okay. An interesting question from Emily Gorman. Thinking about the Anthropocene in space, have geologists formulated past epoch for other planets? And are we just now joining?
I think I understand this. So there are geological epochs for other planets. Some of ours are based on changes in climate, changes in the fossil record as well. And that's obviously something we probably don't have. This is not specifically my area of expertise, but I could tell you, for example, that there's a period commonly called the late heavy bombardment, which is about 4 million to about 3.7 million years ago. Maybe not the right dates, but you can easily look that up, where there was huge amounts of stuff flying around the solar system, hitting things, creating a lot of the heavily cratered surfaces that we see. We also know different planets have had different periods of volcanism. So the Maria, the dark seas you see on the moon, are basalt lava fields. That appears to be in the past, so that's another way of defining a geological epoch. Lots of debate about where they begin and where they end on other planets. It's quite a fascinating area. And of course, the more missions we send to get data, the more we can refine this information. I think what Emily is suggesting, though, is that the Anthropocene could become a unique geological stratum that is across a number of different planets. And that might be a unique thing. I mean, lots of planets have evidence of the late heavy bombardment, for example, and people might remember that a new crater, a massive crater, was discovered in Western Australia I think it was just last month. So we do see geological features even on Earth related to that period. But the Anthropocene, yes, could be said to be, insofar as it is created by human activity, a unique unifying geological feature that crosses many planets. That's a really intriguing idea, Emily. Thank you.
And from Christoph, what is the general astronautical consensus about intelligent life elsewhere? I mean, you might ask about intelligent life on Earth. Intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, possible, probable, or certain?
As far as I understand it, the consensus is that it would be weird if it hadn't evolved somewhere else in the entirety of the universe. The problem is whether we will ever get to communicate with it. So it's a problem of time and it's a problem of space. But statistically, it would seem very odd if a similar circumstance had not happened elsewhere. That's how I understand the situation.
Just one other question from me. Australia used to be in the Space Club, and was among one of the leaders in space research once. I mean, what happened? And I mean, are we still? Where are we now? And what went wrong?
It's astonishing to me how few people know that Australia, by some ways of calculating it, was the third nation to launch a satellite. Isn't that astonishing? And we don't celebrate that. Like, we don't think of how the US treats its space successes and how other countries treat their space successes. And people don't know about it, and we don't celebrate it, which I think is, a terrible shame. A response to your question would also be to say, Richard, that in fact we never stopped doing space, and space has never gone away. What we stopped having was government support for space programs. So basically, Australia was one of the first countries to establish a rocket range capable of launching rockets into space in 1947 at Woomera. And at that time, there were maybe only 4 other locations on Earth where you could launch a rocket into space. So we were there right at the beginning. We were developing our own sounding rockets, which are scientific rockets that just they don't go into orbit, they go into the upper atmosphere. So they get into space, but they come back. We developed our own completely Australian sounding rockets back in the 60s and the 70s. We were very closely involved with tracking all of the US crewed missions, Mercury, Apollo, Gemini, shuttles, all of that. We've got incredible expertise in that area. And we also have incredible expertise in planetary science and astronomy, and radio astronomy was practically invented by Australia. So we have all of this stuff. But what happened pretty much, I guess, you could say 1972, which was the end of the Apollo missions, caused a sort of a downsizing of our engagement with US missions. And then instead of developing the UK, instead of developing the Europa rocket in Australia, decided to just buy missiles from the US instead. And the organisation ELDO, which was a precursor to the European Space Agency, moved its headquarters to Kourou in French Guiana and away from Woomera. So all of these together meant there was sort of just a big collapse in space. And it was kind of like Australia kind of just gave up. So a lot of Woomera was destroyed, stuff was broken up and sold for scrap. People who had been at the heart of the space era became, bitter and disillusioned. And since then, so our space industry has continued. We've had people working on satellites and space science and planetary science the whole time. That never stopped. But what stopped was the successive Australian governments decided it was better to buy services in. And this left us very vulnerable. So particularly in the region, in the area of bushfire monitoring, for example. So we were reliant on other people's data and other people's satellites. We couldn't do it for ourselves. Very fortunately, I'm going to have a little boast here. So in 2017, the Space Industry Association of Australia, of which I'm an advisory council member and a former deputy chair of the board, bid for and hosted the International Astronautical Congress in Adelaide. And in other countries, having this conference has led their governments to create a space agency where one didn't exist before. We kind of hoped this is what would happen, and it did. So for the last 2 years, we have had an Australian space agency, and it used to be said, so after Woomera ended, we got out of the rocket launch game. And it was a dirty word. You couldn't talk about it. We were like, we will never do that again. And look what we're doing now. Australians are building and launching rockets from our own rocket launch sites. So much is happening. There is so much potential. There is so much new space archaeology being created. And I don't know, maybe I'll write another book about it all in a few years' time.
Yes, it's not going to stop. Kate O'Neill had a very interesting comment, I'm not sure what it means, is beer in space, but I think that might have just been a comment along the way, unless you want to say anything more about beer in space.
Well, actually, I will very briefly
And
say, just that, I kind of threw that in as a joke, but it's very serious science, and Sabre Astronautics are a very serious company. And at the moment, like if you go into space or you go to live on the International Space Station, you're kind of roughing it. It's pretty sparse, tough life. And if more people are going to go into space, then we're going to need a few creature comforts, and it's not going to be all about the scientists and the engineers anymore. We're going to have a whole range of different careers and skills and technologies that we'll need. So people shouldn't be deterred from getting involved in space simply because they're not an aerospace engineer or an astrophysicist. In the future, there's going to be all kinds of careers available in space. So just a little bit of encouragement for people out there to get involved.
And it was amazing how much of the early was done just by community, citizen space engineers and so on.
I think that's such an important tradition. So it's not sort of incredibly wealthy companies out there like Australis Oscar V, just, regular uni students with a vision. And I think that's something that's quite inspiring. Now, I've just noticed an interesting question on the chat, Richard, if you don't mind me jumping in. Diane asking my views on the ethics of mining the moon or elsewhere in the solar system. I think this is a really important question. So my first career was as a heritage consultant, working mostly in mining industry. So I've been involved in it firsthand, and I think this sort of gives me a bit of an insight into how things might roll on other planets. I guess there's a lot of ethical considerations. One of the main ones is that the moon in my opinion, should be considered what they call in the legal sort of language, the common heritage of humanity. And because it is the common heritage of humanity, profits from using lunar resources ought to be distributed, or the benefits from those resources ought to be distributed to the people of Earth. This is enshrined in a treaty, the Moon Agreement of 1979, which Australia is a signatory to, but not the US, not Russia, and not China, a number of other spacefaring nations. I don't think we can stop lunar resource extraction going ahead. A lot of it might be solely for the purpose of developing an economy that can go on to Mars. But I think we can do everything in our power to make sure this is done ethically, so we don't end up with a situation where wealthy corporations simply become wealthier, where the whole common heritage of humanity, space is accessible to all, is just an empty rhetoric. And again, I think there's a lot of people, voices are starting to get stronger on this. So if we want to see the use of space become something that is a vision of equality and equity, and not something that drives a division between rich and poor on Earth further apart, then we need more people to add to those voices. And that's certainly where I see a role for looking at heritage in space, to try and make people feel connected and feel like that they have a voice. Because if we don't say what we feel and think now, we'll look around and it will be too late. The moon as we know it will have been altered forever.
Yeah. Joe Christoph has asked a related question, who I should say he already made the comment. It was the solar talk, and I think that's absolutely right. Perfect description of it. But yes, what is advertising of space exploration unnecessary evil or not?
Yeah, these are hard questions. So personally, I'm very excited by space exploration, and I want to know what's out there in the rest of the solar system. I would probably prefer not to have to find out by, having commercial companies exploit this knowledge and this information. And this is a big thing that's up for question. I often say that it's, Elon Musk, it's all great, it's all well and good, but he is not accountable to the public. He doesn't have to tell us what we're doing. And how many science fiction films have we seen where some alien resource is kept secret so that it can be exploited commercially? Aliens is a great example of that, and there's many, many other films. So I was thinking about this in relation to Venus. So there's the possibility that there are these anaerobic microbes up there. What if they have commercial applications? So what if the first probes to go back to Venus to try and get more evidence about this are actually paid for commercially, with a view to obtaining samples that will then be kept secret to develop who knows what? I mean, maybe it's going to be a face cream that will become a bestseller. Maybe it's going to be a chemical weapon. Who knows? So these are things we have to think about. I don't want to presume upon the political views of our audience, but at the current time, we have a sort of a neoliberal commercialized view of space as a resource for humans to use. I've been working on ideas of planetary environments having intrinsic value in their own right and having a right to exist. And with a group of other people, including the Moon Village Association in Australia, we've been exploring the idea that the moon might have legal personhood. And this might be a way to manage its environmental values and start to rethink it as not just an object that humans can exploit. So I think, I don't want to stop. It's interesting when you talk about this, a lot of my space colleagues assume that I'm opposed to anyone going into space. So I'm not. I want to go there as much as the next person. I just want to make sure we do it in a way that, 500 years from now, we can justify that to people of the future. That might sound like a bit of a cliche, but these are the decisions we're making right now.
Do you think you will get into space, personally?
Oh, probably not, I guess, unless, some space baron with billions of dollars decides I'm worthy of a free ticket. But given that I'm very critical of those people, I suspect they're not going to send one my way anytime soon. So I don't think personally I will be going into space. I will just come to Blackheath and play on that will be my space.
Just your last answer touched on another interesting question, I think, is what's the relationship between space exploration and the history of space and science fiction? It seems to me space exploration is constantly catching up to science. What used to be science fiction is now reality. How do they interrelate?
Very interesting question. Something I often find, unlike a lot of archaeologists, I read horrible amounts of science fiction as a kid and still do. A lot of space people as well. And often science fiction writers are much better at imagining the social consequences of different technologies than the people who are actually working on them in the present. So I think science fiction, so less about the technology. The role of science fiction is not to predict. The role of science fiction is to explore those consequences. And there's some remarkable writers who create scenarios that show us what are the range of possible futures that we have. There's certainly been a sort of really interesting feedback effect between science fiction and space science and technology. So the design of the Skylab space station was influenced by an architect, Elliot Noyes, who actually worked on the space station for the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. So, and that's not the only example of that. So you have these sort of little interconnections and interleavings where people are thinking across both fronts, and the two things mutually influence each other. So I think, yes, I mean, I suppose what we should be doing now is is looking very closely at the contemporary science fiction rather than, the classics from the 50s and 60s. What are people writing about now that shows us the range of possible future options that we might be choosing from? Because I think there's definitely a very symbiotic kind of relationship between the two.
And another question just come up: the movie Interstellar. Have you seen it? And did you find it realistic?
I've seen it a couple of times. There's lots of stuff in it I would say is not very realistic. The stuff that really sticks in my mind is when they're on the watery planet and the waves are coming up. I love the robot in Interstellar, by the way. It's one of the most creative designs I've ever seen. And they're talking about time dilation and the particular geology of that world. The other thing I think is stunning about that film is the way they represented, I think it's 5-dimensional space. Pretty hard to do in 3 dimensions, let alone the 2 of a film. But if you haven't seen it and you are driven to, I think it's quite a good film. It's a little bit schmaltzy in places, but you can get past that. The way they represent moving and perception in 5-dimensional space is outstandingly well done. Definitely worth a look.
Okay, well, look, my mind's sort of exploding so much. I think unless there are any other questions coming up, I don't think there are. I think might leave there, Alice. I'd just like to thank you once again for an absolutely fascinating talk. I mean, you've raised so many questions. So we'll leave it there. We'll give you, the applause, the virtual applause that we couldn't. It's a pity we didn't have you in person. And I'd like to just end by reminding people that in a fortnight, we have David Walker, who was first BHP Professor of Australian Studies at Peking University in Beijing, and he'll be talking about Australia's relationship with Asia and China in particular in that crucial sort of middle third of the 20th century. But thank you again, Alice. Fabulous talk, and hope to see everybody in a fortnight. Okay.